Time to take a look at how the Wehrmacht set up defensive positions. At first we take a look at the position of a company in the defense from a manual published in 1940. In the second part we take a look at an example from January 1942, when the Germans were defending themselves with heavily depleted units on the Ostfront against the Soviet attacks. Let's begin with the example from the manual. Here we have the area that should be defended by a rifleman company or Schützenkompanie, which had an authorized strength of around 200 men. Note that the area to the north and south is held by other units. As such, the width of the frontal sector is about 380 meters and the depicted depth about 1300 meters. The main line of combat or resistance, the Hauptkampflinie, usually called HKL in German, was situated here. It was defended by various light machine guns, at this point of the war mostly with MG34s. Note, the MG34 is a general purpose machine gun. As such, it came with various configurations. For the Wehrmacht, the MG34 with a bipod was a leichtes Maschinengewehr, light machine gun, and with a tripod, a schweres Maschinengewehr, heavy machine gun. So the light and heavy indicate the function, not the caliber in this case. But back to the topic at hand. There were a few light machine guns also placed a bit further behind. Additionally, they were also called so-called Schweige-MGs, silent machine guns. The official German army regulation notes about the Schweige-MG: silent machine guns open fire at a close proximity when the enemy cannot find cover during the assault anymore. So in a way the silent has two meanings: first, to hold fire, and second, to silence the enemy. Supporting the machine guns were 3 anti-tank rifles, whereas 2 were placed close to each other. Furthermore, there were 3 light mortars with a caliber of 5 cm and 2 heavy mortars with a caliber of 8 cm. Interestingly enough, the manual notes that these were used alone and not in groups. Fire unit is the single mortar. Note that the company had no organic heavy mortars, as such they were supplied by its superior unit, the infantry battalion. Further behind there were heavy machine guns. As mentioned previously, these were MG34s with tripods. Note that these machine guns were placed in pairs. It should also be added that these tripods were quite sophisticated and expensive. This was due to the fact that the tripod enhanced the machine gun with various mechanics that allowed it to fire at set areas and distances. Now close to the heavy machine guns, but behind the hill, there were 2 light infantry support guns of the caliber 75 mm, das leichte Infanteriegeschütz 18. These weapons used indirect fire, and Forgotten Weapons recently did an in-depth video on the gun itself, so be sure to check out his video. Now you probably ask, if these guys sit behind a hill, how can they hit anything? Well, there was an observer sitting on another hill that had a direct line of communication with the guns. Yet the question is, where are the anti-tank guns in this setup? Well, these were assigned based on the expected necessity. To quote from the manual, the guns are used in platoons or individually where tanks or armored recon vehicles are to be expected. And last but not least, a final look at the frontal area. The wooden area was secured with a wire tree barrier. Additionally, each indirect fire weapon had an assigned area for its fire plan, for which we first need to take a look at the terrain features. These 2 areas here are depressions. As such, they can only be hit by indirect fire. Keep that in mind, because without this information the fire plan might seem a bit arbitrary. Now, unsurprisingly, the target area for the light mortars was the depression closest to the main line of resistance. The heavy mortars would engage the wooded area here, and the light infantry support gun had a second depression and hill assigned. And finally the artillery, which is not shown on the map, would engage this area. Note that it also crossed into the sector of an adjacent company. Now this was a rather ideal situation, so let's move to a setup of a depleted unit under rather bad circumstances. The unit in question was part of the 35th Infantry Division, which participated in the Battle of Moscow. And we are looking now at the situation early January 1942, when the Soviet counteroffensive was conducted. These attacks were often too overambitious and lacked the necessary punch, to quote Glantz. In January 1942, the Soviet leader was incredibly overambitious and optimistic. The contrast between the desperation of November and the success of December encouraged him so much that he attempted to expand the counterattacks near Moscow into a general offensive to encircle all of Army Group Center and much of Army Group North. With this context, let's look at the German report. Note that the report refers to the Soviets as der Russe, which is the Russian. Yes, singular, not plural. So be aware that this is not my choice of words. The Russian probes with scout units in platoon and company strength, seeking weak spots in the village defense. If he is repulsed, he tries to break into the place again and again, even in case of heavy losses. Villages and positions are shelled by him with heavy weapons, especially mortars and tanks, for hours while spending large amounts of ammunition. If he does not succeed in penetrating the village, it is bypassed by skillful use of depressions and forests to threaten its flanks and rear. Therefore, in defending the villages, there must be a continuous, barely spaced HKL around the village. Reserves have to be prepared for counterattack. Another aspect was that these attacks were usually supported by tanks and conducted at times of limited visibility. Additionally, it is noted that assaults often did not exploit any gains and remained rather passive after achieving a break-in. As such, it was deemed paramount to conduct immediate counterattacks to regain the lost positions. To quote, daher muss sofort der Gegenstoß erfolgen. Thus, the counterattack must be performed immediately. For fortifying the village, several guidelines were given as well. Since the buildings were mainly constructed out of wood, they did not provide protection against shrapnel nor rifle fire. As such, it was deemed necessary to immediately begin the construction of dugouts. The dugouts should be located directly behind the emplacements in order to guarantee a quick manning in case of an alarm. A dugout had the approximately size of 3 × 4 meters and contained about 6 men. Positions should not be built within the houses, but under them or behind them. Furthermore, wire obstacles, trees and mines should be placed at crucial points, like entries and exits to the village and blockading the space between houses. Now let's look at the combat example, namely defense of a village in early January 1942, when only a limited number of defenses were set up. On the morning of the 6th of January 1942, a spotter reported the sound of tanks. Alarm was given and after 5 minutes, 2 T-34 appeared on the so-called Panzerhöhe tank hill. Both tanks had several tank riders on them. The field howitzer opened fire and missed, although the tank riders jumped off the tanks and were engaged by the machine guns. They were pinned down and didn't move on. Thus the T-34s moved into the village alone. The first one rammed the field howitzer, yet without causing any damage. The second T-34 moved into the village as well and fired with its main gun and machine gun into every house. Then the tanks waited for the infantry reinforcements. So the infantry came down the hill, yet was engaged by artillery fire and support weapons, which resulted in a breakup of the attack. One of the tanks meanwhile was rather close to the battalion's headquarters. One of the messengers engaged the tank and placing a geballte Ladung, a bundled grenade charge, below the turret. The explosion didn't destroy the tank but locked the turret in place. Soon afterwards the T-34s left the village. Meanwhile the crew of the rammed field howitzer had returned. It engaged the T-34 from behind and destroyed it. The second T-34 would meet a similar fate, when after leaving the village it was engaged by an 88mm flak gun and also destroyed. Note that there's a Panzer III marked on the map, but is not mentioned in the report itself. According to the map, the Panzer III was only used against the infantry. This was likely due to the fact that their main guns had very limited effect on the T-34. And since our tanks often lacked proper infantry support, they could often be engaged by German infantry quite successfully. Something I described in more detail in my video on infantry anti-tank tactics. Now these defenses were rather sparse, yet we have a plan for a more thorough defensive setup one day later. At this point the village was defended by a heavily depleted infantry battalion. The battalion consists of 3 rifle companies, which on average had a strength of around 20 men, whereas the authorized strength was about 200 men per company. As support, the unit received 20 pioneers for building the defensive positions, 1 field howitzer, 1 88mm flak, 2 20mm flak, 1 50mm anti-tank gun and 2 Panzer IIIs. As you can see, this is a vastly different scenario than before, far smaller unit sizes yet different setup of support weapons. The temperature was according to the report about -30 to 40 degrees Celsius and the depth of the snow about 0.8 meters. The defense was set up as follows. First company was located on the left flank, the second on the right flank and third company in the center. All of them had a direct line of communication with the battalion headquarters. Since the ground was frozen, the pioneers had to use explosives to dig in. Here you can see the positions for the different dugouts. To provide additional cover, snowbanks were erected as well, and wire obstacles were placed around the village, northeast of the village, and in the depression to the south. Furthermore, mines were placed on the road in the north, near the village, and also in the depression. Note that the mines in the depression were connected with wires to each other. The position of the light machine guns was as follows. 4 in the area of the first company, defending the north of the village. For the 3rd company there were 3 light machine guns and a pair of heavy machine guns. Similar, the 2nd company had 3 light machine guns and a pair of heavy machine guns here. The 2 20mm flak anti-aircraft guns were deployed on the left side of the village. As previously, the Vielheuzer was positioned between the house and the sector of the 1st company here. The 50mm anti-tank gun was located farther behind near a wooden area. The 88mm flak was set within the village as well. Furthermore, there were 2 heavy mortars, one within the village and another one in the depression on the lower right end of the map. Which brings us to the fire plan of the artillery and mortars. For the latter, there were 3 areas to attack, which were all located within the depression, namely here, here and here. The targets for the artillery were on the top of the hill, the road between the 2 minefields, and also an area within the depression. Finally, there were 2 Panzer IIIs sitting behind a house next to the battalion headquarters. To summarize, one of the key differences between the 2 defensive setups is that the heavy machine guns were placed far behind in the manual version, whereas in the actual combat report they were often on the same line than the light machine guns as well. Sadly, I found no information why. There are several points that come to mind. First, in the example in the manual, the heavy machine guns sit upon a hill in the back, thus they can engage the whole area. Likely such a position was not available in the defense of the village. Second, the defense of the combat example lacked depth, unless there were further units that are not shown on the maps. This was likely due to the extreme depleted units and may also due to the fact that the Soviet attacks were rather uncoordinated and did not exploit further attack after break-in. As such, a defense in depth was not necessary or possible. Yet an aspect that wasn't changed was the fact that the heavy machine guns were deployed in pairs. One aspect which is a bit counterintuitive is the position of the anti-tank gun rather far behind and the position of the 88mm flak gun close to the front. And it is likely due to the fact that we only have a very limited perspective, since the field of fire of the 88mm flak gun might be quite extensive outside of the map. Whereas the field of fire for the anti-tank gun is minor, it is clearly limited by the hill and village. Additionally, it is on the flank of the village, thus increasing the chances of penetrating any tanks that drive down the hill by firing at the side armor. Anyway, these are just my thoughts. I know we have some people with military background and veterans here, so let me know what you think. I hope you learned something new. If you like this content, consider supporting me on Patreon. Remember, every single dollar helps. Thank you here to Phil, Spartan and Galgenvogel for translation advice and map reading. As always, source are linked in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.